"Get out of my house. You're a barren mistake." Silas screamed the words right before his hands hit my chest. I flew backward. My shoulder slammed into the exposed wooden studs of our half-gutted kitchen. I was 38, wearing a stained gray sweatshirt, shivering in the February draft of Des Moines, bleeding from where my teeth caught my bottom lip. The impact shook the entire wall. A jagged piece of drywall crashed to the linoleum floor. And there it was, covered in plaster dust, wedged tight between the pink fiberglass insulation and a cold copper pipe, a yellowed, sealed envelope. 3 weeks later, Silas was sobbing on his knees in a crowded courtroom while police officers locked cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. His face went entirely white as the echo of his own voice bounced off the mahogany walls. But as I sat there bleeding on the kitchen floor, he had no idea what he had just unleashed. He thought he broke me. He just gave me the map to destroy him. My name is Vada Sterling. If you saw me on the street, you wouldn't look twice. I blend in. I wear neutral colors. I walk softly, and I don't speak unless I have something to say. Most people think quiet means weak. They think if you don't yell back, you're surrendering. I make my living as a private investigator. Mostly boring stuff. Background checks, tracking down missing heirs for estate lawyers. But my actual job, my real superpower, has nothing to do with databases or surveillance cameras. My superpower is patience. I remember everything people say to me. Every single word. I don't react. I absorb. I let people talk until they hang themselves with their own sentences. My grandfather Elias taught me that. He was a quiet man who survived a brutal childhood and a harder war. He used to sit on his porch in East Des Moines, smoking a pipe and watching the neighborhood. He always said, "Let 'em think you're deaf until it's time to scream." That one thing about me? It's the reason this story has the ending it does. Before Silas, my life was small, but it was mine. I had a little apartment near Grays Lake. I drank bitter black coffee every morning at 5:30 a.m. while watching the water freeze over in the winter. My dream was simple. Buy a tiny cabin up by the Raccoon River, get a golden retriever, and never have to explain myself to anyone. And then I met Silas, and for the first time in my life, I thought I'd found my person. I was wrong. I was so wrong. We met at a hardware store on a rainy Tuesday. I was trying to figure out which drywall anchors wouldn't rip out of my cheap apartment walls, and he just appeared. Tall, broad shoulders smelling like cedar and rain. He didn't mansplain. He just offered a suggestion, made a self-deprecating joke about his own disastrous DIY projects, and asked if I wanted to grab a coffee. He was charming. God, he was charming. He had this way of looking at you like you were the only breathing creature in the room. I remember our second date at a little Italian place downtown. We ate risotto that was slightly undercooked, and we laughed so hard I spilled red wine on my white blouse. He didn't miss a beat. He poured a drop of his own wine onto his shirt so I wouldn't feel stupid. Looking back, the warning was right there. Flashing neon. I chose to see it as quirky. When the waitress brought the check, she accidentally handed it to me. Silas snatched it out of my hand so fast his fingernail scratched my wrist. He laughed it off, but his eyes went completely dead for a fraction of a second. I told myself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. The contamination of our marriage didn't happen overnight. It was a slow drip of poison. Before it escalated to the winter nights and the sharp, undeniable stench of another woman's perfume, the invasion began in the quietest, most vulnerable spaces of my daily routine. It began in the mornings. Mornings had always been my sanctuary. Even after we bought the house in the suburbs, I maintained my 5:30 a.m. ritual. The rest of the world was asleep. The sky outside the kitchen window was a deep, bruised indigo, and the house was perfectly, beautifully silent. It was the only time the air in the house belonged entirely to me. It was a Tuesday in early October. The kitchen was cold, the slate floor tiles sending a sharp, waking chill through the soles of my bare feet. I stood at the granite counter, completely immersed in the sensory rhythm of making my coffee. I poured the whole beans into the conical burr grinder. The beans were an Ethiopian dark roast, heavy and slick with their own oils. The smell was magnificent, a dense, earthy aroma of damp soil, toasted cocoa, and bitter smoke. I pressed the button on the grinder. The machine roared to life, a loud, mechanical, violently grinding sound that vibrated through the granite and up into my palms. It was a harsh noise, but it was my noise. It was controlled. When the grinding stopped, the silence that followed was thick and satisfying. I tapped the stainless steel portafilter against the tamping mat. The metal was heavy, cold, and solid in my grip. I locked it into the espresso machine, watching the pressure gauge climb, listening to the low building rumble of the boiler, waiting for the frantic hiss of the steam. The hot water hit the grounds, and the scent of the coffee blossomed, filling the cold kitchen with a thick, golden warmth. I held my favorite ceramic mug beneath the spout. The mug was handmade, slightly asymmetrical, with a rough, unglazed bottom that scraped softly against the stone counter. I was at peace. I was entirely grounded in the physical reality of the moment. Then the air pressure in the room shifted. I didn't hear his footsteps. He was wearing thick wool socks. But I felt the sudden, suffocating weight of another body entering my space. "You're up early," Silas said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that scraped against the quiet morning. He stepped up directly behind me. He didn't leave a polite distance. He stood so close that the fabric of his cotton pajama shirt brushed against the thin silk of my robe. The sudden, overwhelming smell of him completely obliterated the rich, earthy scent of my coffee. It was a sharp, aggressive blast of synthetic eucalyptus body wash, layered over the stale, sour ghost of the scotch he had been drinking the night before. The combination was dizzying, chemical, and deeply intrusive. I tensed, my shoulders instinctively rising toward my ears. "Just making my coffee," I murmured, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark liquid streaming into the ceramic mug. "Move," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a flat, blunt directive. Before I could even shift my weight to step aside, he reached directly over my right shoulder to grab a glass from the cabinet above the espresso machine. As he brought his arm down, he didn't adjust his trajectory to avoid me. He simply moved as if I were not a physical object occupying space. His heavy forearm slammed hard into my elbow. The impact violently jerked my hand forward. The heavy ceramic mug, already half full of boiling, freshly brewed espresso, tipped over the edge of the drip tray. I gasped as the scalding liquid splashed down the front of my silk robe, instantly soaking through the thin fabric and searing the tender skin of my upper thigh. The heat was a sudden, shocking agony, a sharp, biting burn that forced a sharp cry from my throat. The mug hit the slate floor with a loud, hollow crack, shattering into 3 jagged pieces. The dark, oily coffee splattered across the gray tiles, pooling rapidly around my bare feet. I stumbled backward, instinctively clutching at the wet, burning silk clinging to my leg. The skin underneath was already throbbing with a hot, rhythmic pulse of pain. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't drop the glass he was holding. He didn't reach out to see if I was burned. He just stood there, looking down at the shattered ceramic and the spreading puddle of dark liquid, his jaw muscles clenching in extreme visible annoyance. "Jesus Christ, Vada," he sighed, the sound heavy with exaggerated exhaustion. He took a slow sip of water from his glass, his eyes completely dead, devoid of any human empathy. "Look at this mess. You're always hovering. You're always just standing right in the way. You need to be more aware of your surroundings." I stared at him, my mouth slightly open, the sharp, stinging pain radiating down my leg. "You hit my arm, Silas. You reached right over me." "I was getting a glass of water," he said smoothly, his voice dropping into that calm, reasonable, utterly terrifying tone he reserved for when he was about to rewrite reality. "You jerked your arm back. I saw you do it. You're so jumpy lately. It's like living with a startled cat." He reached over to the roll of paper towels on the island, tore off a thick, coarse sheet, and threw it lightly. It landed on the counter next to the espresso machine. "Clean that up before it stains the grout," he said. He turned his back on me and walked out of the kitchen, his heavy footsteps retreating down the hallway, leaving behind nothing but the harsh chemical sting of his eucalyptus soap and the agonizing, burning sensation spreading across my skin. I stood alone in the cold kitchen. I looked down at the rough, dry paper towel. I looked at the shattered pieces of my favorite mug. The rich, beautiful smell of the coffee was gone, replaced by the bitter, acrid scent of scorched grounds and wet slate. I dropped to my knees on the freezing floor. The rough texture of the paper towel scraped harshly against the smooth tiles as I wiped up the mess, my hands shaking, my thigh burning, the first cold seed of absolute doubt taking root in the deepest part of my mind. It became a physical reality on a Thursday evening in late November, the kind of bitter, unforgiving Iowa night where the sky bruises into a deep, violent purple and the freezing rain turns the world into a blur of gray static. I was in the kitchen making dinner. The house was locked against the winter darkness. I remember the exact sensory weight of that room, the ambient, low hum of the furnace kicking on, vibrating softly through the soles of my wool socks, the rhythmic, wet drumming of the rain lashing against the glass of the bay window. I was standing at the granite island, chopping garlic and rosemary. The kitchen was a sanctuary of warmth and texture. The heavy, comforting scent of roasting chicken and melting butter filled the air, thick and golden. The chef's knife made a sharp, satisfying thwack, thwack, thwack against the dense bamboo cutting board. The garlic skin was papery and dry beneath my fingertips, crumbling perfectly. I felt grounded. I felt entirely safe. Then the deadbolt turned. It wasn't a smooth click. It was a harsh, aggressive clunk that seemed to echo too loudly against the tile floor. The front door swung open, and a violent rush of freezing wind tore through the hallway, instantly slicing through the warm, butter-scented air of the kitchen. The temperature in the room plummeted. The drafting wind brought with it the metallic, sharp tang of ozone and wet concrete. "Silas?" I called out, wiping my hands on a dish towel. He didn't answer immediately. I heard the heavy, wet squeak of his leather dress shoes dragging across the oak floorboards, a slow, lethargic sound. When he finally stepped into the warm light of the kitchen, the air around him felt wrong. It was heavy, dense. I walked over to him, smiling, reaching out to help him with his coat. As my hands grasped the lapels of his heavy wool overcoat, a deeply unsettling sensation crawled up my arms. The fabric, usually soft and familiar, felt rough, sodden, and stiff like cold armor. But it was the smell that made my stomach drop. Silas always smelled like cedarwood and a faint hint of peppermint. It was his signature. But as I pulled the damp coat from his shoulders, the cedar was buried. Overpowering it was the sharp, synthetic, cloying stench of a cheap floral perfume, something heavy with artificial vanilla and sickly sweet jasmine. It was a scent that clawed at the back of my throat. It smelled like a stranger's neck. It smelled like a lie. I stood there, holding the heavy, wet garment, my lungs filled with the scent of another woman. "Long day?" I asked, my voice instinctively dropping an octave, testing the waters. He didn't look at me. His jaw was locked, the muscles fluttering rapidly beneath his skin, tight as a coiled wire. "Traffic was a nightmare," he muttered, his voice flat, hollow, devoid of the warm resonance that usually filled our home. He moved past me, his shoulder brushing mine. The physical contact was jarring. He felt rigid, completely devoid of heat like a mannequin. He stepped up to the granite island and pulled his phone from his pocket. He set it down. It wasn't a gentle placement. It was a sharp, definitive clack of glass against stone. The sound hung in the air, jarring and out of place. I turned back to the cutting board. The warmth of the kitchen was gone. The smell of the roasting chicken now made me feel slightly nauseous, mingling violently with the lingering ghost of the vanilla perfume. I picked up the chef's knife. Then the phone vibrated. It wasn't a gentle chime. It was a harsh, mechanical, rattling buzz that violently shook against the hard granite. The specific frequency of the vibration seemed to drill directly into my teeth. Bzz, bzz. Silas practically lunged across the kitchen. The friction of his thumb frantically swiping the glass screen was audible, a desperate, dry scrape. The sudden, stark blue light of the screen illuminated his face in the dim kitchen, casting harsh, skeletal shadows under his eyes and highlighting the tight, panicked tendons of his neck. Psst, psst. He hit the side button to silence it, but he wasn't fast enough. The frantic, rhythmic stutter of the notification had already poisoned the room. "Work," he said abruptly, not looking up from the screen. He shoved the phone deep into his trouser pocket. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were completely opaque. Dead. The same dead eyes I'd seen at the Italian restaurant. He exhaled, and I smelled his breath. Mint toothpaste, desperately chewed, masking something metallic, like adrenaline, like fear. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. I absorbed the texture of his wet coat, the stench of the cheap jasmine, the rattling buzz of the phone, the cold rigidity of his jaw. Every sensory alarm in my body was screaming, deafening me with the reality of what was happening. It started with his phone. 6 months in, it started living face down on the kitchen counter. Then came the new passcode. When I asked about it, he looked at me like I had just suggested the earth was flat. "I deal with sensitive client information, Vada. You of all people should understand security." Then came the sudden gifts. He would disappear for 4 hours on a Saturday, claim he was at the gym, and come home with a $200 bottle of perfume. Guilt gifts. I knew the psychology behind it, but when you're in the middle of it, you convince yourself you're just being paranoid. The real fracture happened after the miscarriage. I was 10 weeks along. We were sitting in the pale fluorescent light of the doctor's office. The ultrasound tech got very quiet, excused herself, and brought in the doctor. There was no heartbeat. I couldn't breathe. The room started spinning. I reached out for Silas's hand. He didn't take it. He was looking at his phone. When we got to the car, I was sobbing. I felt hollowed out. Silas started the engine, didn't look at me, and sighed. A heavy, annoyed sigh. "Well," he said, his voice flat, "it's probably for the best. You've been so stressed anyway. We don't need a defective situation dragging us down." My stomach dropped. My hands went ice cold. Defective. He called our lost child a defective situation, and that was the night I checked his coat pocket. What I found. I still can't say it out loud without my hands shaking. The escalation didn't come with fireworks. It came with 1,000 tiny cuts designed to bleed me dry of my sanity. It started with public disrespect. We were at a dinner party at his boss's house in West Des Moines. I was talking to the host's wife about a book I'd read. Silas walked up behind me, put his hand heavily on my shoulder, and chuckled. "Don't listen to Vada," he said loudly, silencing the room. "She barely reads the back of cereal boxes. She just parrots whatever she hears on podcasts." The table went dead silent. I felt my face burn. I looked at him, waiting for the punchline. He just stared back, his eyes daring me to cause a scene. I swallowed the humiliation and looked down at my plate. Beat 2 was isolation. He started picking apart my relationship with my younger sister, Clara. Clara was my lifeline. She was loud, messy, and fiercely protective of me. "She's toxic, Vada," Silas would say, leaning against the doorframe while I cooked. "She just uses you for money. And honestly, her voice gives me a migraine. I don't want her in the house anymore." When I fought back, he didn't yell. He just took my car keys. "You're too emotional to drive right now. You're acting crazy." He left me stranded in our suburban house for 2 days. I had to cancel my client meetings. I was a prisoner in my own life. Then came the replacement phase. I found a blonde hair woven into the collar of his wool coat. I have dark brown hair. When I held it up to him, he didn't even blink. He lied with the kind of practiced ease usually reserved for politicians and toddlers with chocolate on their faces. "It's from the girl at the bakery, Vada. Are you seriously going to interrogate me over static electricity? You need help. You're becoming unhinged." Beat 4 was the systematic assassination of my reality, the true terrifying labyrinth of his psychological warfare. It didn't happen in a screaming match. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon in the living room. The sunlight was pouring through the blinds, casting warm, geometric shadows across the hardwood floor. I was sitting on the leather sofa, reading a file for a missing persons case. Silas walked into the room. He wasn't angry. He wasn't aggressive. He was terrifyingly clinically calm. He was holding a small black leather-bound notebook. He sat down in the armchair across from me, leaned forward, and steepled his fingers. He looked at me with a gaze so heavily laden with manufactured pity that I felt a physical weight press down on my chest. "Vada," he whispered, drawing out the syllables of my name, like he was speaking to a frightened toddler. "We need to talk. I can't ignore this anymore. I'm worried about you." I closed my file. "Worried about what?" "Your episodes," he said softly. He opened the black notebook. The pages were filled with his neat, cramped handwriting. "I didn't want to do this, but Dr. Evans suggested I start keeping a log, for your own safety." My heart gave a strange, fluttering kick against my ribs. "Dr. Evans? The therapist you refused to go to with me?" "He's advising me on how to handle your decline," Silas said smoothly, not missing a beat. He looked down at the notebook. "Let's talk about what happened at the bank on Tuesday." I frowned, entirely confused. "The bank?" "I wasn't at the bank on Tuesday. I was downtown, pulling public records at the courthouse." Silas offered a sad, slow shake of his head. He reached out and gently patted the air between us, a placating gesture that made my skin crawl. "Vada, sweetheart, please don't do this. Don't lie to yourself. You were at the Chase branch on University Avenue. The branch manager, Tom, called me. He said you were screaming at the teller. You were demanding to withdraw $50,000 in cash, claiming I was trying to poison you." The breath left my lungs in a sudden, violent rush. "What? Silas, that is insane. I didn't go to the bank. I haven't been to that branch in months. Check my location history, check my phone." "You left your phone here, Vada," he said, his voice dripping with sorrow. "You left it on the kitchen counter? I found it when I came home. You were wearing your blue trench coat, the one with the missing button. Tom described it perfectly." I stared at him. The room began to tilt. My blue trench coat had a missing button, but it had been at the dry cleaners since Monday. "My coat's at the cleaners," I said, my voice trembling. "Silas, what are you doing? Why are you making this up?" "I'm not making it up, Vada," he said, his voice suddenly rising just a fraction, injecting a perfect note of desperate frustration into the quiet room. "Why would I make this up? Look at me. Look at what this is doing to us. You are completely dysregulated. You are losing time, just like when you forgot to pay the mortgage last month." "I didn't forget," I practically shouted, standing up from the sofa. The leather groaned beneath me. "You took the check off the counter. You told me you mailed it." Silas closed the notebook with a soft, definitive snap. He leaned back in the chair and looked at me as if I were a rabid dog he was trying to coax into a cage. "Listen to yourself. Listen to how paranoid you sound. I stole the check? I'm making up bank managers? Vada, this is psychosis. Your grief over the miscarriage. It's broken your mind. You are projecting your own failures onto me." "Stop it," I breathed, backing away from him. My hands were shaking so violently I had to clench them into fists. "Stop doing this. I know what is real." "Do you?" he asked, his voice dropping back to a sinister velvet whisper. He stood up slowly, moving toward me with measured, predatory steps. "Because Clara called me yesterday. She said you called her crying at 3 a.m., saying there were people living in the attic. She's terrified of you, Vada. She asked me if I thought you needed to be committed." "Clara would never say that." Tears of pure, hot frustration spilled over my eyelashes. I reached for my phone on the side table to call her, to prove him wrong, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Silas's hand shot out. He didn't grab my wrist hard enough to bruise, but his grip was unyielding. He took the phone from my hand and slipped it into his pocket. "I'm setting a boundary," he said calmly, looking deep into my panicked eyes. "I am not letting you harass your sister with your delusions. You need rest. You need medication. You are sick, Vada. You are so, so sick." He held my gaze until I finally looked away, completely broken by the sheer, impenetrable wall of his absolute conviction. He didn't just want to lie to me. He wanted to rewrite my reality until I couldn't trust my own memories. He wanted me to believe I was insane, so that when he finally discarded me, I would blame myself. Beat 5 was the sleep deprivation, the systematic, calculated dismantling of my biological reality. It is a terrifying thing to realize that your own exhaustion is being weaponized against you. Sleep deprivation strips away your emotional armor. It leaves you exposed, raw, and entirely susceptible to suggestion. The world begins to feel slightly out of focus, like a camera lens smeared with Vaseline. There is a persistent, low-grade, dull ache at the base of the skull, a gritty feeling behind the eyelids. It happened on a Thursday morning. It was 3:14 a.m. I know the exact time because the harsh, bleeding red digits of the alarm clock on the nightstand were the first things I saw when the suffocating weight of my deep REM sleep was violently shattered. The heavy down comforter was suddenly, violently ripped away from my body. The freezing blast of the bedroom's air conditioning hit my sweat-damp skin like a physical blow. My heart rate spiked instantly, a massive, sickening flood of adrenaline surging through my veins. I gasped, my eyes flying open to complete darkness. Then, a blinding, searing beam of pure white light struck me directly in the face. I threw my hands over my eyes, shrinking back against the headboard, my breathing ragged and shallow. The metallic taste of absolute panic flooded my mouth. "Wake up," Silas said. His voice came from the darkness behind the flashlight beam. It was completely flat, clinical, devoid of any sleep-induced grogginess. "Stop it. Stop screaming." I wasn't screaming, I stammered, my voice trembling violently as I tried to peer through the blinding glare. "Silas, put the light down. You're blinding me. I was asleep." "You're lying again," he said quietly. He didn't lower the light. He kept it trained precisely on my dilated pupils. "You were thrashing like a lunatic. You hit me, Vada. You hit me in the jaw." I didn't hit you," I pleaded, my mind scrambling to make sense of the sudden chaos, desperately trying to access the memories of the last few hours. Nothing was there, just the heavy, dark void of sleep. I was just sleeping, I swear. Silas lowered the flashlight slightly, angling the beam down to illuminate his own left forearm. He stepped closer to the bed. "Look at this," he commanded, his voice hardening into a sharp, unforgiving edge. I squinted. In the harsh white light, I could see 3 distinct angry red scratches running vertically down the pale skin of his forearm. They looked fresh. They looked exactly like fingernail marks. My breath caught in my throat. I looked down at my own hands, my fingers trembling uncontrollably in my lap. Had I done that? Had I been fighting in my sleep? The sheer, overwhelming wave of guilt and confusion crashed over me, suffocating my logic. I don't remember," I whispered, tears of pure exhaustion and terror welling in my eyes. "Silas, I'm so sorry. I don't know what's happening to me." He clicked the flashlight off. The sudden darkness was almost as disorienting as the light. "Who is Mark?" Silas asked. The question hung in the pitch-black room, heavy and dangerous. "What?" "Mark," Silas repeated, his tone dripping with cold disgust. "You were screaming for Mark, over and over again. You were begging him to come back. Who is he, Vada? Are you sleeping with someone else? Is that why you're losing your mind? Because of the guilt?" "I don't know a Mark," I cried out, the frustration tearing at my vocal cords. "Silas, please. I don't know anyone named Mark. I was dreaming. If I said anything, it was just a dream." I heard the soft, definitive rustle of paper. I heard the click of a pen. Even in the dark, I knew exactly what he was doing. He was writing in his little black notebook. He was documenting my psychotic break. "Get up," he ordered, the sound of the pen scratching aggressively against the paper. "Get up right now. You are out of control. You need to cool down. Go downstairs." "Silas, it's 3 a.m, I begged, shivering violently in my thin cotton nightgown. "Please, just let me sleep. I'm so tired. My head hurts." "You're not sleeping in this bed if you're going to be violent," he said, his voice entirely devoid of mercy. "Downstairs, now." I dragged myself out of the bed. My legs felt like lead. Every muscle in my body ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I stumbled out of the bedroom and began the long, humiliating walk down the stairs. The hardwood steps were freezing against my bare feet. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and warp, my sleep-deprived brain struggling to process the visual information. I sat at the kitchen island for 2 hours. Silas stood leaning against the counter, perfectly awake, perfectly composed, drinking a glass of ice water. He didn't let me turn on the main lights. We sat in the dim, gray, ambient glow of the street lamp outside. For 2 straight hours, he interrogated me. He asked me the same questions over and over again, his voice an endless looping drone that battered against my fragile consciousness. He asked me about Mark. He asked me why I wanted to hurt him. He asked me if I thought I belonged in a hospital. By 5:15 a.m., I was sobbing uncontrollably, my forehead resting against the cold granite counter. I was apologizing for hitting him. I was apologizing for screaming for Mark. I was apologizing for a reality that never existed, simply because my brain was too exhausted to fight him anymore. When he finally allowed me to go back to sleep, the sun was already beginning to rise. I lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling completely, utterly hollow. I didn't trust my own hands. I didn't trust my own dreams. I was a prisoner inside my own failing mind. Orla was beat 6, Silas's mother. She had the emotional warmth of a meat locker. She came over for Thanksgiving, walked into my kitchen, and ran her finger over the counter, checking for dust. We were alone in the kitchen when she delivered the strike. She was carving the turkey. She didn't even look up. "Silas tells me you're struggling to conceive again," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "It's a shame. A real woman would have given him a son by now. Some women just aren't built for purpose. You should let him go before you ruin his life completely." I dropped the serving spoon. It clattered against the tile. Silas walked in right at that moment. "What's wrong now, Vada?" he sighed. "Your mother just told me I'm not a real woman," I choked out, tears stinging my eyes. Silas looked at Orla, who smiled sweetly. Then he looked at me. "Stop twisting things, Vada. She didn't say that. You're always playing the victim. Apologize to my mother." I didn't apologize, but I didn't fight back either. I was drowning. Beat 7 was the spatial violation, the ultimate disrespect. I came home early from a surveillance job on a Thursday. I walked into my house and heard laughter coming from the kitchen. I walked in to find a woman sitting on my kitchen island. She was blonde. She was wearing my favorite oversized sweater. She was drinking coffee out of my favorite mug. "Oh, hey," Silas said, not even flinching. "This is Naomi from accounting. We're just going over some quarterly reports." Naomi smirked at me. "Love your sweater. Hope you don't mind. I got a little chilly." My marriage was currently functioning like a smoke detector with a dying battery. Annoying, persistent, and entirely unhelpful. I knew they were sleeping together. He knew I knew. But he wanted me to snap. He wanted me to look crazy. "Take off my sweater," I said quietly. Silas slammed his hand on the counter. "Don't talk to my guests like that. Go upstairs, Vada. You're embarrassing yourself." Beat 8 was the institutional threat. The night he realized I wasn't going to just fade away. We were arguing in the hallway. I told him I wanted a divorce. I told him I wanted the house. He backed me into a corner, his face inches from mine. "You'll get nothing. I'll tell the judge about your depression. I'll tell them about your little breakdowns. I'll have you committed, Vada. I will lock you in a psych ward and throw away the key. Nobody will believe the crazy Barren woman." Which brings us to the cruelest moment. The kitchen renovation. He decided we were gutting the kitchen to add value to the house. Really, he just wanted to destroy the space I loved most. He was tearing down the drywall with a crowbar, sweating, aggressive. I asked him to stop because it was 10 p.m. and the neighbors were going to call the cops. That's when he snapped. "Get out of my house. You're a barren mistake." He shoved me, hard. I flew backward, my shoulder slamming into the exposed wooden studs. The pain radiated down my arm. I tasted blood in my mouth. I sat there on the cold linoleum, covered in plaster dust, staring at the man I had promised to love forever. And then the piece of drywall crashed down, and the yellowed envelope fell out. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just looked at the envelope. I waited until he stormed out of the house, tires screeching in the driveway. I crawled over to the wall. My hands were shaking as I pulled the envelope from the insulation. It was addressed to Silas. The return address was a P.O. box. The handwriting belonged to Naomi. I tore it open. There were 3 photographs inside. A little boy, maybe 4 years old. He had Silas's eyes. He had Silas's chin. And there was a letter. Silas, the kid needs braces. The $103,700 you transferred from your joint account was a good start for the house down payment, but I need more. Keep the Barren wife distracted. If she finds out about us or the boy, I'm taking you for everything. Love, Naomi. I sat in the dust for 2 hours. I didn't know it then, but this habit of sitting in the quiet would save my life. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't pack my bags. I didn't confront him when he came home drunk at 3 a.m. I became a ghost in my own home. What nobody knew was that I'd found the letter 3 months before the divorce hearing. I had 90 days to build a cage so tight he would never escape. My secret weapon wasn't my private investigator license. It was human patience. I bought 3 voice-activated hidden recorders. I sewed one into the lining of his favorite winter coat. I taped one under the passenger seat of his car. I put one inside the air vent in his home office. For 3 months, I listened to him talk to Naomi. I listened to him laugh about my miscarriage. I listened to him detail exactly how he forged my signature to drain $103,700 from our joint savings account to buy her a townhouse in West Des Moines. I collected bank statements. I collected the forged documents. I kept the letter in a safety deposit box, and I visited my secret ally, Marcus. Marcus was an old high school friend. He also happened to be the head AV technician at the Polk County Courthouse. He controlled the microphones, the speaker systems, the recording software for the court records. I sat in a diner with Marcus, eating cold French fries, and slid a USB drive across the table. I need a favor, I said. A big one. Marcus listened to the audio file on his laptop right there in the booth. I watched his jaw tighten. He closed the laptop, looked at me, and nodded. What day is the hearing? I remembered Grandpa Elias. Let them think you're deaf until it's time to scream. I was ready to scream. The Polk County Courthouse was a massive, intimidating building filled with heavy oak benches and the constant, buzzing hum of overhead fluorescent lights. It was a Tuesday morning, the divorce hearing. Silas was wearing a custom navy suit. He looked like a magazine cover. Orla was sitting right behind him in the gallery, wearing a smug, tight-lipped smile. Naomi wasn't there, but I knew she was waiting for his text. I sat at the petitioner's table in a plain gray dress. I looked exhausted. I played the part perfectly. The judge, a stern woman named Abernathy, adjusted her glasses. Mr. Sterling, you are contesting the division of assets, claiming your wife is mentally unfit and has contributed nothing to the estate. You are also claiming you have no knowledge of the missing $103,700. Silas stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at the judge with those big, earnest eyes. Your Honor, Silas said, his voice dripping with fake sorrow. My wife has suffered severe mental breakdowns since her medical failures. She is paranoid. She hallucinates. She spent that money in a manic episode. I have tried to care for her, but she is abusive and unstable. I just want to move on with my life. Orla nodded emphatically from the gallery. The judge looked at me. Mrs. Sterling, do you have a response? I didn't stand up. I didn't speak. I sat perfectly still, letting the absolute crushing weight of the silence stretch out, long and agonizing, across the vast expanse of the courtroom. I did not rush. I did not break. I simply existed in the quiet. Time seemed to slow down, thickening around me like cooling amber, trapping every microscopic detail of the room in perfect, permanent clarity. The air in the courtroom was incredibly heavy, carrying the distinct institutional smell of sharp lemon floor polish, brittle old paper, and the faint, sour tang of nervous sweat baked into the wooden benches. High above us, a singular geometric shaft of pale morning sunlight cut through the tall windows, illuminating millions of tiny dust motes dancing slowly, lazily in the stagnant air. I looked at Silas. I wanted to memorize this exact moment. I wanted to burn the arrogant architecture of his posture deep into the permanently scarred tissue of my brain. I analyzed him with the cold, clinical precision of a mortician. He was standing so tall, his broad shoulders thrown back proudly inside that expensive, custom-tailored navy wool suit. His chin was tilted upward in a practiced, defiant angle. The knot of his silk tie was perfectly symmetrical. There was a faint, almost imperceptible sheen of confident perspiration resting lightly on his brow. He looked like a man who had already won. He looked like a man who was already tasting the expensive champagne he planned to drink with Naomi later that night. His left foot was tapping, a tiny, rhythmic twitch against the carpet, a subtle tell of his suppressed, vibrating excitement. He was so incredibly, profoundly certain of my total destruction. I shifted my gaze past his shoulder to the gallery. Orla was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, sitting rigidly in her pew. Her lips were pressed together into a thin, victorious line, her manicured hands resting neatly over the clasp of her leather purse. She thought she was finally rid of the defective daughter-in-law. She thought the bloodline was secure. I looked down at my own hands resting in my lap. They were perfectly steady. These were the hands that had chopped the rosemary in the winter kitchen, while the smell of another woman's perfume poisoned the air. These were the hands that had scrubbed the scalding coffee from the slate floor while he mocked my pain. These were the hands that had shaken violently in the dark at 3 a.m., terrified by a reality he had entirely fabricated. These were the hands that had bled onto the linoleum. These were the hands that had meticulously, obsessively sewn a tiny black microphone into the silk lining of his favorite winter coat. My mind drifted back to the cold linoleum of the kitchen floor, the gritty, chalky taste of plaster dust, and the sharp, hot copper tang of my own blood in my mouth. I thought of the freezing mornings by Gray's Lake, drinking bitter coffee in the dark, trying to figure out how to survive the day. I thought of the years I had spent shrinking myself, doubting my own sanity, apologizing for things I hadn't done, letting him rewrite my history with a black notebook and a velvet whisper. Done. Let them think you're deaf, Grandpa Elias's voice echoed in the quietest, deepest part of my mind, the words rumbling like distant thunder. Until it's time to scream. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool, overly conditioned air of the courthouse fill my lungs down to the very bottom. The crushing, suffocating weight of the past 3 years finally lifted off my chest, evaporating into the dusty air. I looked up at the small, black, square speaker mounted high in the corner of the ceiling. Then I slowly opened my hand. My phone was resting face up on my thigh. The screen was already glowing, burning a stark, cold blue against the gray fabric of my dress. The messaging app was open to Marcus's contact thread. A single one-word message was typed into the text box. Now. My right thumb hovered over the smooth glass. The physical sensation of the glass was incredible. It felt impossibly smooth. It felt cold. It felt absolute. It was the metaphorical guillotine, and my fingerprint was the blade. I pressed send. The glass didn't yield. It just accepted the command. The tiny gray arrow turned blue. Delivered. I didn't move my hand. I kept my eyes fixed on Silas's profile. 1 second passed. The silence in the courtroom remained absolute, punctuated only by the rhythmic, hollow ticking of the large brass wall clock behind the judge's bench. Tick, 2 seconds passed. Silas shifted his weight slightly, a tiny furrow of annoyance appearing between his perfect eyebrows. He was waiting for me to cry. He was waiting for me to break down and prove his narrative right. Tick, 3 seconds passed. Judge Abernathy frowned deeply, her patience finally fraying. She leaned forward over the heavy mahogany bench, opening her mouth to repeat her question. Mrs. Sterling, I asked if you... A sound tore through the room. Sterling. It started as a low, guttural, electronic hum, a deep vibration that traveled instantly through the heavy oak tables, rattling the brass fixtures and vibrating against the soles of my shoes. It was a dark, mechanical growl. Then, in a fraction of a second, the hum violently spiked. It escalated into a sharp, high-pitched, glass-shattering whine of pure audio feedback. The frequency was agonizing, a metallic squeal that seemed to drill directly into the roots of my teeth. Everyone in the room physically flinched. The reaction was primal and immediate. Judge Abernathy winced sharply, her eyes squeezing shut as she instinctively reached up to tap her microphone, glaring toward the side of the room. "Bailiff, check the audio system immediately. We are getting severe interference." The bailiff, a large man in a tan uniform, took a single hurried step toward the wall panel, but before his heavy boot could touch the carpet, the speaker cracked to life. It wasn't static. It wasn't the muffled overflow from another courtroom. It was a voice, Silas's voice, loud, crystal clear, entirely stripped of its manufactured velvet charm. It was raw, cruel, and echoing with brutal, undeniable clarity off the high mahogany walls, raining down over the entire room like a sudden, freezing downpour. "She's a barren mistake. I've been bleeding her dry for years." The physical transformation of Silas Sterling was instantaneous, and it was, without a single doubt, the most profoundly beautiful thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life. He froze, his entire body locked up, rigidly paralyzed, as if he had just been struck by a massive, high-voltage electrical current. The confident, arrogant architecture of his face collapsed in real time, the muscles slackening and giving way to absolute naked panic.